Thank you very much, Ms. MC. Thank you also very kindly to my former colleagues at ISIS Malaysia, still my friends at ISIS Malaysia, for willingly collaborating with the Asia Society Policy Institute on this Asia launch of our report. It is a homecoming of sorts, personally and professionally for me, because as I mentioned, I used to be at ISIS Malaysia. I'm still affiliated with ISIS Malaysia. But professionally as well, this report was targeted for Southeast Asian stakeholders, both government and non-government. And to have this launch in a city in Southeast Asia, in my home country, is special. And so I hope that those of you in attendance in person here, as well as those tuning in, will find some benefit from our policy recommendations in this report. I'm just going to speak very briefly about how we came to this report, the drivers behind it, and then I'll hand over to Mark to talk a little bit about our policy recommendations that we're offering for your consideration. There were two main drivers that underpin this project that eventually led to the publication of this report. And those two underlying questions are these. One, internally, for each and every country in Southeast Asia, beyond just the 5 countries that we covered in this report, for every country in a region as diverse as Southeast Asia, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, religiously diverse, how should we be thinking about data and data-driven technologies in Southeast Asia beyond how we've been thinking about them? We've primarily been thinking about them through economic terms. We see digital and data-driven technologies as a stepping stone to growing our economies, to leveraging on the potential of our micro, small, and medium enterprises online. But should we be thinking about data and data-driven technologies like AI in a different way? If one of the main drivers of technology is to minimize, to reduce, to correct social and economic inequities, and if those inequities have been prevailing all these years, then perhaps we need to rethink, reframe, and reconceptualize how we think about data and technologies like AI. How do we represent ourselves and our diversity through data and through data-driven technologies like AI, so that we represent ourselves in our own image as opposed to the image of others in technologies like AI? You'll see in our report that in our survey of the 5 countries, all those countries have mainly been adopting and adapting these technologies along with the frameworks, the governance frameworks, even the values, norms, and rules of those technologies. But perhaps we need to be doing more proactively to contributing to some of those standards, rules, norms, in order for us to represent ourselves more adequately in some of those technologies and the governance that underpins them. Secondly, beyond the internal dimension of representing ourselves in technologies and building our nation through technologies, how do we represent our perspectives, our knowledge systems, our values even, to the world through data and data-driven technologies? We're mainly users, adopters, and consumers of technology now. Shouldn't we in this region, around 650 million of us in Southeast Asia, how do we represent, again, our knowledge systems, ourselves as producers, creators, and designers of tech instead of merely users and consumers? We've been very content to be the latter. Perhaps we need to be thinking a bit more about actually producing, conceptualizing some of those technologies. Otherwise, we risk becoming mainly derivatives of developments elsewhere. It works fine for us now. But in thinking beyond the next 5 to 10 years, we should even be thinking over the next 5 to 10 years to be those designers, producers, and creators of technology like AI. So those were the two main internal and external questions that really drove the rationale of this project. And if you flip through our report, you'll see that there is a thin strip of differently colored pieces of paper right smack in the middle of the physical report that represents what Mark and I call the policy playbook. And this represents a bridge, both conceptually, visually, as well as tangibly, to the two main sections of the report, data and AI, because there are obviously linkages between data and AI. And we invite you to think of data not as something to be the basis of evidence-based policies, right? That's another buzzword that we all like. We invite you to think about data as also tools of power, of influence, and of dominance. And if we don't represent ourselves adequately, proportionately, satisfactorily in the data sets that we produce, that we share with the world, then we're not going to be represented in the technologies that are marketed and sold back to us. We also invite you to think about data and data-driven technologies as tools to advance human dignity rather than just tools to grow the economy. Because what use is functioning a good economy if, at the essence of it, human dignity is not preserved or advanced? And this especially comes to bear when we're talking about marginalized, underrepresented communities, including indigenous communities that have a very different outlook on data and technology than what we are used to. In the survey of the 5 countries that we've done in the report, there has been some consideration of indigenous communities, but the assumption is that they will be subsumed in the frameworks that we operate within. There are alternative approaches that are shared with us that we haven't really considered by indigenous communities in this region and beyond, but also by scholars in Africa and Latin America that we haven't considered. We model ourselves mostly on the global north because they're so advanced technologically. But developmentally, we share many similarities with other regions in the global south, and we should be considering their scholarship and their approaches to data and technology more seriously. So let me pass the mic on to Mark to talk a little bit about our policy recommendations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lena. And I think latching on what she said about homecoming, about 5 years ago, I also had my first Soft Power in Southeast Asia Forum in Penang. I was a very young scholar back then, and that was an event that was sponsored by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So somehow, as a Southeast Asian, it's also a homecoming for me. And I think I'd like my remarks to be more personal and candid in a way of how we conceive this project. And there are a lot of conversations in my kitchen table in Honolulu every Wednesday morning with Elena about this project. And we're just very glad to really bring this report home to Southeast Asia in Kuala Lumpur and really share it with the Southeast Asian policymakers, but also those who are very much digitally savvy in this region. So allow me to discuss the sort of policy recommendations that are embodied in this report. And I'd like to thank Elena and Asia Society for the agency and the autonomy to work on this particular project, and also to the Australian government for the funding for this report, and also to ISIS Malaysia for the very warm welcome here in KL. So I think the policy playbook, which Elena has alluded to and mentioned, it's found in the middle of the report, and we consider it as a connective tissue between the relationship of data and artificial intelligence, where data is foundation to training algorithms and also building AI systems. But more so, it reflects how Southeast Asian at the current moment is thinking about digital transformation and digital technology, and how the symbiotic relationship of data and AI plays out in the region, not just in the immediate term of digital transformation, the buzzwords of digital economy and AI race, but more so on how agency and autonomy really strikes at the heart of this project. So when we were conceiving the policy playbook, the question that Lena posed, how do we raise the standards in Southeast Asia on data and artificial intelligence? And the policy playbook is we offer that for your consideration as the solution in a way. It is a policy toolkit that is informed mainly from the social-technical approach that looks at technology not from a rational sort of perspective, but how the humans, communities, and societies relate to technology. Rather than being governed by technology, it is about that sort of mutualistic relationship that we harness in terms of building better communities and better lives, not just for the sort of immediate gratification of achieving digital transformation, but thinking through how do we live in this digital society and digital age where human dignity is intact and at its core. And when thinking about the policy playbook, it is informed and we acknowledge a lot of the existing principles that are put forward by various institutions, but mainly the 5 principles that are advanced, which are agency, care, equity, reliability, and inclusion, are really a reflection of the empirical evidence we gathered scanning and canvassing the 5 country case studies. And also combining that with the social-technical approach that looks into this relational aspect of technology and human interaction. And so the policy playbook provides principles, which I've mentioned, the 5 principles, but also practices, which policymakers can use and implement as they deal with the challenges of data-driven technology, and also with the pressure of the global digital economy. And let me say this up front, that the policy playbook is an evolving policy toolkit. It will continue, we envision it as a living policy document that will continue to evolve based on the experiences in Southeast Asia as they go through their AI journey. And let me just lay out sort of 3 underlying premises when we're conceptualizing the policy playbook, which also reflects some of the initial thoughts and feedback and perspectives we got during our initial launch in Washington, D.C. I think the first underlying premise that we have for the policy playbook is really thinking through about what is not being said in this conversation about data-driven economy. How do we design new realities that are not being talked about in the mainstream conversation or media? In this sort of argument, we put forward thinking about alternative data governance frameworks. We often hear in Southeast Asia about this debate about data localization and sort of data free flow. But what we wanted is to push the point further and advance this notion of data stewardship, where the end users get the most value of data extraction. It's not just about this big established ICT large companies who get the most out of the economic value of data in the world that we live today. We also looked into the second underlying premise is looking into the global and local connection. In a lot of majority in our case studies, oftentimes, Southeast Asian countries are very much online and very much involved in the sort of current trend in digital economy. But what we also see is that a lot of the innovation, particularly in countries such as Vietnam and Thailand, are driven by the local needs of the population. So there are somehow in this sort of crossroads, Southeast Asia is in this crossroads of harnessing or leveraging their distinct social, cultural, and technical perspectives, but how do they also sort of cope with the pressures of the digital economy? So I think we see this approach majority from Southeast Asia that they're thinking about data-driven economy from a very global perspective, but we also see this growing agency and autonomy, particularly from the perspective of local innovators. And also, I think the last sort of underlying premise that we were thinking about the policy playbook is currently in Southeast Asia, at least, conversations on establishing ethical AI frameworks are still very scant. And what we've realized is the policy playbook in itself hopefully serves as the foundation for the region to think about ethical AI, data-driven approaches. The 5 principles that we put forward would serve as the catalyst for greater cooperation and greater policy coordination. That Southeast Asia, again, given the current trend lines of great power competition and fragmentation of global supply chain, we hope that the policy playbook will serve as that policy toolkit for Southeast Asia to navigate this very complex terrain of geotechnological competition, but also molding and shaping technology akin to their local needs that preserves and maintains human dignity. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
So I'd like to start with giving my thanks for Harizal for your opening remarks, and for Alina and Mark for your presentation, and of course the production of the report, and for the team for organizing this event as well. So I'm Jun-e. I'm a senior research associate with the Khazanah Research Institute, and I work on digital and tech policy issues within the context of Malaysia and Southeast Asia. So I've been invited to moderate this conversation with our esteemed discussants, whom I will introduce now. We have Ms. Undral Gambata. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Ms. Undral is Head of Social and Human Sciences Programming at the UNESCO Jakarta office, which covers 5 Southeast Asian countries, including Brunei, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Timor-Leste. And she's done work on youth development and capacity building, and promotion and implementation of ethical norms of AI. And I understand that she's worked before for the government of Mongolia, and within the Prime Minister's unit. Welcome. And we also have Ms. Annabelle Lee, the head of digital policy of the Asia Pacific and Japan region of the Amazon Web Services Public Policy Department. And she has deep subject matter expertise on data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and emerging technology, both from the industry and government perspective, as she's worked before with BSA, the Software Alliance, and also the Personal Data Protection Commission of Singapore. And she's also worked a fair bit on AI governance with the Singaporean government. So the structure of our conversation, I've put it as such. I've allocated 5 minutes each for Undral and Annabelle to reflect on the report, relating it to their work and how their organizations might find it useful. And then we'll have a 20-minute discussion around all of us with the authors and the 2 discussants. And there will also be a 25-minute Q&A session, inviting questions from audience within the room and also from the live stream as well. I understand that you can post questions on the Asia Society's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter platforms under the hashtag of Asia Society Live or hashtag Raising Standards. So there will be staff monitoring these platforms, and they will post them to the group as well. So before I pass the floor on to the discussants, I also want to just point out some quick points on the report. I think that the authors have done a lot of groundwork surrounding AI and data policies within the region, and mapping of the current landscape on not only the digital economy side, but also data for public policy. And this is going to be a fantastic base for further policy research. Thank you very much. And there's a lot of things to like about the report. And one of the key things is that it really asks some important baseline questions that cautions us against a techno-utopian kind of approach. For instance, what is the ultimate purpose that data-driven technologies serve? And whose ethics are we operating on? And also, how can we use data-driven technologies to enable rather than reduce agency on the transition towards digitalization? So it also takes a decidedly systemic view, putting forth situating technology in society, and also it puts Southeast Asia back into our own context, bringing it back into the region with its cultural diversity and its local challenges. and that the reality is that Southeast Asia will need to adopt and adapt standards coming from other parts of the world, EU, China, US, and other multilateral agreements, for instance, and we will need to do some sort of form of patchworking when it comes to governance approaches. And we will also do well if we can learn from other regions, such as Latin America and Africa. And more broadly, we have to consider a more multi-stakeholder kind of participatory approach. And perhaps we should reassess the way that we look at the metrics of performance and success. I think that was very important as well. So I really appreciated the recommendations given in the playbook section, and they're organized according to 5 principles, which are also very systemic and very participatory, and we will go through that further in detail in the discussion later. So may I pass the floor to Ms. Undral for your comments on how the report might relate to your work and what you think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Salamat datang, and a very good morning to everybody. First, I'd like to say thank you to ISIS Malaysia for inviting me here to be a part of this event. And it's really a pleasure to interact with colleagues at ISIS Malaysia, the Asia Society Policy Institute, Pacific Forum, and AWS. And hopefully, we can extend the conversation to other colleagues in attendance today. And I've said to Mark and Elena before, I hope this is just the beginning of a collaboration between our institutes and not the end point. UNESCO is the lead UN agency on bioethics, which not everybody knows. I think when people hear that I work for UNESCO, they assume I'm sort of cultural inspector. I come to Kuala Lumpur and I look at heritage buildings and I say, okay, you can keep the World Heritage, stamp for 1 more year. But that's what UNESCO is most known for. But we have a very long history, starting to when we were, founded in the 1950s, of pondering the ethical questions of the frontier science and technology of that time. And it was with this precedent and with this history that we were given the mandate by our 193 member states to develop the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. It is unique in that it's a global instrument. Of course, there are EU guidelines, there are regional frameworks, but this is unique in that it has the endorsement of 193 member states of UNESCO. So my work in the region, I am now based at the UNESCO Jakarta office, which has 5 countries under its mandated cluster. Previously, I was at the Bangkok office of UNESCO. It's guided by the values and principles of this recommendation in terms of assisting member states in translating the values and principles into policy, and also what we might say is downstream activities in terms of building capacity among other stakeholders, such as young people, working with research institutions, working with universities to produce knowledge products within this research area. I would say it's one of our priorities that we want to elevate and develop knowledge products from Asia-Pacific voices. And I think this is one of the things that we might agree on, is that a lot of the knowledge on AI ethics research is produced by North American and Western European institutions. So it's one of our priority areas that we want to elevate other regions in this aspect as well. So that's sort of the background of UNESCO's work in this area. And I think in terms of the report, there's a lot of synergy between our findings and the findings in the report that Mark and Alina have identified. There's a lot of resonance within the policy playbook and some of the things that we are trying to work on within UNESCO. We have an ethical impact assessment and a readiness benchmarking methodology that we are offering to our member states, and I think that resonates with the findings in the policy playbook, that there's a need for reassessing measurements and things like that. So to wrap up, that's the sort of entry point for UNESCO, and I look forward to interacting more with my colleagues in the panel. Thank you, and over back to you.
Sorry, excuse me. Selamat datang, everybody. Good morning. And again, like my colleague to the right, thank you so much for ISIS for inviting us here today to speak. And of course, Alina and Mark, congratulations on the launch of, I think, what is probably the most wonderful report I've ever read. I was smiling when I was reading the report because I think it's probably the first one I've read that truly reflects an Asian, and more specifically a Southeast Asian voice. And I think just looking across this panel today as well, the people who are thinking about these issues actively are from this region, are very familiar with this region, and understand what are the social and cultural norms that we need to take into consideration as we kind of rush forward and move forward with digital economy, with digital transformation. We throw these words around a lot all the time. And I think that was something that really stood out for me for the report. Just a bit of context on where I'm from. So I'm from Amazon Web Services. We're maybe the slightly lesser well-known part of Amazon. We provide cloud infrastructure and platform services, so it's probably not the most exciting sounding thing, but really what we do is for our customers every day is basically provide the underlying infrastructure for them to build services, technology services on us. And our customers are extremely varied, right? Ranging from startups, SMEs, non-profit organizations, governments, and then of course your big MNCs and kind of local large enterprises. In speaking with customers across this particular region, what we've realized is that the words that are being used, and so later we'll talk a little bit about your recommendations, hopefully, but the words that are being used to describe how we think about society and how we think about success in society. Same words, maybe in English, very different meanings. And one thing that comes up very often for us is the concept of Asia and prosperity. And often I think we jump to the idea of prosperity being economically driven. More money, more business, growing your GDP numbers, these are all obviously important. But I think prosperity in Asia goes beyond that. It goes beyond just the economic angle. In fact, prosperity is about having and enhancing society as a whole, being able to bring forward very, I think, important and fought for cultural dynamics and relationships within very, very diverse societies. I'm from Singapore, and Singapore has very core tenets around ethnic and racial harmony, right? And it was something that was fought for many years. And so when we talk about prosperity, it has to come with that kind of concept of inclusion as well. And I think that would, be reflected in many different ways across the rest of ASEAN too. And when we look at how ASEAN and Southeast Asia as a community speaks about inclusion and speaks about their goals, it's often about trying to find consensus. And consensus building is really important, again, because what we are trying to encourage is a harmonious society across Asia. This is not something that is easily captured or reflected in anything that we've seen, I think, as you've rightly pointed out, Alina, in the Global North. And so about 3 years ago, I worked with the Singapore government, and we saw, and I'm going to state this pretty bluntly, we saw the emergence of AI and AI governance and ethics policy becoming very exciting globally. And we saw the Europeans speaking about it, the Americans speaking about it, and the Chinese speaking about it. What we didn't see was Southeast Asia's voice. And we didn't want it to become a conversation that was geopolitically driven between America, the EU, and China. Right? We felt that it was really important to bring a different dynamic into that global conversation. And so the Singapore government made an effort to effectively develop ethics principles, governance principles, responsible AI principles that were customized for Singapore first, but hopefully for the region second, and be able to use that as a competing approach or model on the global stage to then talk about how it's not just about an EU version of ethics or an American version of business development. So it really, I feel really grateful to be here today to be able to speak on this issue, because I am very passionate about how we bring inclusion in, and hopefully I'll be able to share a few stories later on as I was looking through your recommendations of things that we're already doing. I think we can do it in bigger ways, but we're doing it here and there to help with inclusion already and using technology for that. But how do we ensure that that is ultimately something that is going to be top of mind for governments in this region, articulated in a manner that is understood across the region, but also importantly understood globally? Because at the end of the day, when we bring our point of view to the global stage, it needs to be something that people can engage on and understand, and we need to be able to do that. So I'm very excited to talk about that. Final point to note, as I started off, I said Asian prosperity to our customers, to the governments that we work with in this region means something broader than just economic growth. And this is something that we have consistently heard from our customers as well. So one of the other reasons why I'm here is I'm also representing our customers' voice. We have startups and SMEs as well as nonprofits across this region doing amazing things with data and with AI to support inclusive communities. So how do we, and they're actively thinking about new ways to be able to do it better. So how do we work through a public policy lens, but also with actual businesses on the ground who are actively thinking about how do we do this, how do we build something better for my own immediate society, and support them on all their efforts there. So I'll just stop my comments there, and hopefully we'll get a chance to dive deeper in.
Thanks, Undral and Annabelle. So both of you brought up the point on AI ethics, so maybe we can go a little bit into that. So the policy playbook in the report is organized by 5 principles. I think that those are kind of like AI ethics principles, if I view it with my lens. And they include, agency, care, equity, inclusion, and reliability. So from my view, I think that they're very much more broad and systemic compared to those AI ethical principles that come from, say, the global north, which are quite narrow, focusing on, for instance, transparency, explainability, responsibility, privacy, kind of doing no harm kind of approaches, instead of taking one step back, what is the technology for, how do we include people, how do we make it equitable, and how do we provide people with agency. So what are your views on that, with your background in AI ethics? What do you think of these principles, brought forth by the report?
Maybe I can just quickly start. So first of all, I want to say that these 5 principles are probably the most human-centric and human dignity focused that I've seen so far. I think a lot of the time we've seen in global principles sort of, at least one, usually focus on human centricity or human dignity. But the articulation of what that actually entails doesn't go into this level of detail. So I want to say, first of all, that I think that in this regard is very groundbreaking, putting the human at the center of all these technology developments. I think my immediate response in relation to some of the recommendations around, for example, agency, and I was reflecting about this quite a while, I think we have to be, so at a principle level, I completely agree with everything that's been written. But I think when we look at it one step lower, I think we need to think about what are the societies and the micro communities that we're actually talking about, and how do we start with them, right? And think about, if you're designing for that micro community or that particular society, what are the agency levers that need to be put in place? What are the circumstances, and I always say this data is being used for a reason, what are the circumstances in which they want more agency over their data? Because a blanket statement of I need more agency over my data is not the most useful, even though it is, really something I guess we should all work towards. So really going down into those community levels, I think about some of the other discussions that exist on community data. For example, I've been talking to my colleagues in New Zealand on Maori sovereign data, and one of the very interesting elements of that is how community-driven it is, right? So Maori community getting together, articulating what they care about, why they care about the data, in what particular way, what are they trying to achieve when they talk about agency and control. So I would challenge perhaps a follow-up version of this report, or, any other government who's trying to think about that next level of detail to maybe identify a few of these initial micro-communities and start working through what agency means for each of them. And that might then build up a very good framework or baseline set of principles we can then use to address the concept of agency in particular.
If I'm not struggling with the mute button on Zoom, I'm struggling with microphones. All right, this one works better. Again, with the human-centric approach to ethical AI, it also resonates again with the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence from UNESCO. And I think an ethical framework is a really interesting approach, because it works as a response in cases where there is no regulation, or there cannot be regulation, which is a very dramatic way to put it, but without overstating the value of AI technologies, because sometimes we are in danger of creating too much of a buzz on AI. But it is a really, really relevant topic, and we're approaching it from so many different angles, from the research angle, from the multilateral agency angle, from the private sector angle. So it is something that's really creating a buzz in the region. So in the sense that it is a type of frontier technology, it's very important that we have a common ethical framework, or a common set of norms that we are agreeing to, because we're exploring in a way frontier aspects. And in terms of responding to what's in the report, I can see that different countries in Southeast Asia, they're developing their own policy and legislative environment on AI ethics and data and different aspects of digital transformation, and it's at different stages of development, or at different stages of digital transformation. So for me, what resonates from that report is that perhaps there's an angle for a regional approach to having a framework in addressing these issues, and I think that jumped out at me, and I think that's where the connection with the human-centric values espoused in the UNESCO recommendation were relevant to me as well. So this is something that I would point out, and like Annabelle is doing at AWS. We're also working with indigenous communities and the different communities in our member states, looking at the different aspects of data, different approaches to personal data, and how different communities look at it as well. So to wrap up, there's so many different aspects to it, and I think what's valuable is that there's a common framework that is a very ethical framework, and a human-centric ethical framework to tie together all of those things. So that's sort of my initial reflection on the policy framework and playbook in this aspect.
Yeah, so hopefully our report will join the voices for this emergence of this common framework, because I do think that it puts forth some principles that were not very much addressed in the other frameworks of ethics of AI. So moving on to the authors of the report, I was wondering, while writing the report, were there any insights that were surprising to you, to both of you?
I don't know that I was surprised by anything in particular. Perhaps one of the things that jumped out at me that I wasn't expecting so much was this response from a number of our stakeholder consultations that really demonstrated a lot of interest, if not enthusiasm, about a regional approach that both Annabelle and Onjal were also talking about. So on the one hand, there was a focus on national level initiatives, but on the other hand, there was also a real keenness to have an ASEAN-wide approach to presenting the region's perspectives at international forums on standards, on governance frameworks. I wasn't expecting that, because I thought everybody was really focused on their efforts at the domestic level. And so hearing that was very heartening. And it gave me hope that perhaps we can indeed have some sort of a framework or set of guidelines that we can present as a region eventually at international forums.
Just a quick one. Definitely there's strength in numbers. I think we would be able to negotiate better as a bloc instead of as individual countries. Was just also wondering if you have any idea on what would be a good platform, promising platform for this sort of regional.
I think one of the striking sort of reflection from the Washington, D.C. launch was the same question that you raised. And like I said during the D.C. launch, if Lena and I were to be more ambitious beyond this report, we hope that the policy playbook sets the stage for a regional approach and to kickstart a more in-depth conversation. And with, as Annabelle has mentioned about the human centricity of the policy playbook, I think I would also argue that we, in the region, in Southeast Asia in particular, consensus building is a very key to how we make decisions. And I think we are at the stage where harmonizing regulations, this greater debate about innovation versus regulation is at the heart of Southeast Asia's digital journey. But also what Elena and I foresee in this conversation moving forward is not just a binary of data standards or ethical framework, but a spectrum of ideas that represents and recognizes the variation and also the nuances in the journey of every Southeast Asian country. Because as we have also figured out and also identified and reconfirmed in our country case studies, that every Southeast Asian country, although we're very tied to a very broad goal of advancing the digital economy, they are also hamstringed by various challenges, but also have various opportunities along their way. So instead of looking at it at a very binary kind of approach, we look at the policy playbook, particularly the 5 principles, as the spectrum of a framework that Southeast Asian countries can reflect using their own local context, but also being able to have that sort of regional approach at the ASEAN level.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I wonder if we have time to go a little bit. Yeah, we do. To go a little bit into the recommendations, down one level. I think that the recommendations are great. I really enjoyed them. And one of it is, for instance, under the principle of agency, which I feel is really important to our context here in Southeast Asia. And the recommendation is the mapping of international concepts to local languages, like creating a corpus of interpretations. So that is quite useful, I think it would be, because working on other projects, we often come up with the problem of having to translate what privacy is in other languages as to conduct data collection, for instance. So that's one recommendation that stood out to me, for instance. So going back to the discussants, did any of the recommendations stand out to you, and why?
Still not working. Just on your last point, I guess that's why we need to have regional level conversations on this, right? Because even going back all the way to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was a criticism that it doesn't consider Asian concepts of human rights. So when we talk about things like translating words like privacy or all of these terminologies, Asian concepts of privacy or community might differ from Western concepts of privacy or transparency. So I think that's a very important consideration in terms of translating it into our regional context. I am not Southeast Asian, but I am from the Asia Pacific. I'm from Northeast Asia. So that also is something that I would identify with as well in terms of, like I said, most of the guidelines or the knowledge products or the research on this area emergence from North American and Western European global North context. I think we are, within UNESCO, working to acknowledge that in terms of, as I said before, our work on work with indigenous communities or young people in Asia Pacific in terms of elevating their voices and knowledge products, to be mindful of this and to reflect this in our capacity building initiatives. So just a very quick response to what you said on that. And I also wanted to say a little bit about what Mark and Elena pointed out about the focus on the digital economy in terms of what Southeast Asian countries in the report have identified as important when it comes to why is there such a big focus on digital transformation or on the implementation of AI technologies. One practical example I can use for what's there beyond the focus on digital economy. In Indonesia, we are supporting the national stakeholders on the development of a national action plan on disability policy. I'm not jet lagged. Disability policy. So we have been organizing with the National Research Institute a series of policy dialogues and symposiums on different aspects of disability rights, looking at the data collection methodologies, disability inclusion in COVID-19 response. So we've been looking at a number of areas as it relates to disability rights and social inclusion. And one of the things that they requested from us was they were interested in the use of AI technologies as a form of assistive technology in helping integrate people with disabilities into urban life and a general participation in public life. And of course, when you're talking about the implementation of assistive technologies, there comes with that policies framework for the ethical use of those technologies. So for me, that was quite interesting because it's looking at, for us, tying together our work in terms of supporting policy making, in this case, disabilities policy, and the bioethics side of the work, which is led by the normative instrument. So that was interesting in that it's something which has an outcome that is more social justice based or social inclusion based. So it's not really digital economy, but if you think about it, if you're increasing the ability for different kinds of people to be involved in public life, that has an economic impact. So I guess in a way it is a direct impact, not an indirect impact, but for me that's another way of looking at what is the benefit of focusing on digital transformation or AI technologies without necessarily looking at it from a purely economic-driven lens.
Thanks very much. So Annabelle, do you have any recommendations from the book that stood out to you?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to pick, one or two. So I'm going to go with three, but really quite a lot of them stood out, and I thought they were really wonderful. I think the first one that stood out for me was this kind of capture of the new approach towards thinking about data governance. And I felt like that was extremely relevant because I think as we move into an era where governments and societies are talking about data sovereignty, I think that we can't really change it, but that a lot of that conversation has emerged out of Europe. And I think part of it has been, kind of this pitched as a very adversarial battle between, companies, governments, and then citizens. And that really shouldn't be the way it is. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are risks, and making sure that we have the right guardrails and frameworks and laws in place to ensure that people do not get exploited and their data doesn't get exploited is extremely important. But juxtaposing it as a fight, an eternal fight that cannot be solved, I don't think that's true. And so I think this new approach towards thinking about data governance, the idea that, there are certain situations in which you want to keep data local. There might be cultural reasons for why you want to keep data local. There might be, other reasons that means that you like your data closer to you. That's fine. Right? That doesn't also mean that you cannot have data flow. And so I think thinking about it from the governance perspective, thinking about it from a more utility perspective, what are you actually using this data for? What are the risks? what is the right strategy in each of those situations. So that one stood out for me, and I think I'm hoping that we'll find ways to amplify that message as more and more things are created in the region, because I don't think that we should have it be a runaway kind of conversation that has been set up by Europe in particular on sovereignty. The second kind of thing that stood out for me was in relation to the inclusion pillar, particularly where it related to sorry, I apologize. It was actually in reliability, but I actually look at it as inclusion because I see these two are quite similar, which was the idea of creating an AI bias bank. We need to find a better way to describe it. It seems to be that we're pushing the opposite thing. And so I know part of what what was recommended there was on algorithmic bias. I would actually go a bit further to say that one of the things that we've seen, in actual use cases, is how AI can actually be used to identify bias in data. So often, like, we talk about bias, and it's very, it's quite broad and theoretical. But actually, I think the two simple ways of thinking about where bias can emerge is bias in data. So we often say, and then bias in the models that are built. So part of the bias in the models that are built could come about due to bias in data. And what we've actually found through more and more kind of what we call responsible AI tools, so AWS has built a few, but there are many in the market as well, is around basically trying to identify bias in the data in the first instance. Because, and this is true for everything, rubbish in, rubbish out. If you put bad data in that's already biased, you get a biased model at the end of the day. Don't be so surprised. At the end of the day, one of the most important things is solving for bias in data. And, sometimes it's about identifying biases you didn't even realize was there. So a lot of the inclusion issues that we are seeing across the board, like, have banks been using data that has resulted in them, marginalizing the availability of credit to certain communities, right? That wasn't actually very possible to look at easily when you were dealing with an individual who was making a decision, because through experience they know, someone with this sort of application background is probably not going to pay something back, but they're not really saying exactly why. Versus actually looking at hard data and going, okay, well, there is some bias. Okay, we've accounted for risk and so on and so forth, but there is some bias that wasn't actually intentional, and then trying to improve the data and actually building better data sets to address that kind of bias. So that was the second one that jumped out at me. And I think the final one that really jumped out at me was the concept of self-governance. I think as a starting point, it was an extremely useful concept, but I think that, and this is coming from my world and the privacy world, that we run the risk of pushing too much of the responsibility to the individual as well. So I think individuals should ultimately have self-determination, but when we are talking about marginalized communities, when we are talking about the individual man, right, like one person or woman, or non-binary person, it's very difficult to exact your autonomy. And just because you give people the legal right to do so, it doesn't mean that they can exercise it. And that's something we've learned in privacy, because when we started with consent, everybody thinks consent is a great idea. Obviously, you want consent, you can say no. The reality is people very rarely say no, because situations are not set up easily for them to say no. And also it's very taxing on an individual to keep on saying no. So thinking about it more holistically from an accountability perspective and holding people to account and making sure that laws and regulations reflect that is extremely important. So I think it has to be a balance, and I would say it's definitely the right starting point, but then it has to be balanced against that self-determination. I know I said 3, but my last one is international standards, and we spoke a lot about kind of bringing that regional view. I think thinking about how we can leverage organizations, including private sector, including non-profits, to actually go and actively advocate in standards community setting bodies is deeply important. So like even as we speak today, AI ethics standards are being developed at the ISO level. Biometric standards are being developed at the ISO level. How are we as a region, how are we getting involved in those conversations? How do we make sure that that marginalized voice is represented? I think that's something that we can do better on. So we push international standards all the time. We focused a lot of the things we recommend on innovation and ensuring that innovation can continue. Can we add inclusion to that equation as well, and inclusion can. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thanks very much for your opinions. They were really good. I think that we need to go to Q&A, but I would be very curious to know very quickly from the authors if there's any one recommendation you would like to highlight that's dear to your heart. What would it be? Yeah.
I think I would really emphasize this notion of, although we talk about data, artificial intelligence, and sometimes we sound very technocratic about it, one of the, for me, key takeaways from the recommendations is this notion of diversification of perspective. And we talk about, reimagining or re-examining what does privacy means, what does security means in Southeast Asia. And this is where the roles of anthropologists, sociologists, and historians come into play. And oftentimes these voices are not included whenever we discuss about reliability, transparency, accountability, and all that. But I think what the report really envisions is really a conversation, as Annabelle has mentioned, a human-centric conversation, but also a community-driven conversation where we don't just always give the microphone to the data engineers and analysts and the AI specialists, but also to the social scientists and those people we don't suspect to be part of this conversation in digital economy. Because during our stakeholder conversations, I think in Southeast Asia, we take it for granted how digitally savvy the region is already, given the rapid pace of digital penetration and connectivity. But when it comes to thinking about or debating about data, AI standards, ISO, IEEE, I think the conversation becomes very limited to the those with technical background. But I think it's a disservice to all the expertise that every individual can offer, given that technology is something that we live through as a society every day. So, yeah.
Fling past the mic. So I think for me, very briefly, just to piggyback on Mark's point, not just historians, linguists, anthropologists, but also creative artists. And you'll see that in the report, we give an example in Africa of how creative artists embedded messages into traditional fabric patterns to convey a message that they wanted to. And so thinking beyond the binary, outside the box, whatever phrase you want to use, I think it's going to become increasingly important as we think about how we want to place ourselves in international conversations on data and everything digital. Just as a side note to that, but also I think a fairly relevant point for us to consider, is because of all these innovations that are taking place in regions in the global south, particularly in Africa, in South Asia, and in Latin America, we need to be paying more attention to those conversations. We don't do enough justice to our fellow brothers and sisters in these regions, and so we're missing out on scholarship, and perhaps we will have time to talk into this, that goes into concepts like relational aspects of technology rather than rational aspects of technology. In Africa, they talk about how to implement Ubuntu into technology. In Latin America, there are conversations about buen vivir. And in Southeast Asia, we don't really see, at least from our literature review, we haven't really heard or seen of any conversations or scholarship on concepts that are indigenous to this region. Thanks very much. So with that, I'd like to open the Q&A session. If there's, okay.
Thank you to the presenters. I'm Juita Muhammad, a former ISIS researcher. Please allow me to ask a question and some sub-questions on data localization. So at the ASEAN level, there is a working plan or a working program on e-commerce, but what they have achieved so far is the regulatory review on e-commerce and possibly on data flow. So streamlining and harmonizing of e-commerce and also data flow regulations have not been achieved just yet. And this again goes back to the pros and cons of data localizing or like anti-data localizing policies. So again, to attract FDIs, free cross-border data flow is ideal. But looking at the ASEAN countries, this may not be the case, given the country's capacity and also awareness and also priorities on the ground. So coming back to Malaysia, Malaysia has not yet set a data localization policy, but for Vietnam on the other spectrum, it's also very open to cross-border data flow as it has recently introduced its data localization policies. So again, as you mentioned that in your policy playbook, ASEAN or different members within ASEAN should look at data localization framework in a non-binary manner. So how then would you implement it from the bottom-up approach for the domestic level and up towards the ASEAN or regional level? Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more question, or yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Robin Bush. I'm with the Asia Foundation. And I have a question that is perhaps similarly related to Dr. Juwita's question. Hi, Juwita. First of all, congratulations on the report. It's an incredible report. It's going to be very useful for the Asia Foundation's work on inclusivity within the digital economy. So this is really a tremendous resource that you've given us. So thank you for that. My question relates to, again, similar to Dr. Juwita. How would you say that the Southeast Asian countries that you're wanting to bring into the discourse on data governance would fall along the poles that Mark mentioned at the beginning between the positions on data free flow versus complete localization or domestic regulation? You've talked about a spectrum rather than having to choose between the binary, and that makes sense. But how do you align that with this regional approach or ASEAN approach that the speakers have talked about? And to what extent do you see on the ground in your stakeholder interviews are the kind of the geopolitical framework that we're all familiar with playing into this? Thank you.
So
I think part of the answer comes from our stakeholder consultations themselves. And this goes to both Juwita's and Robin. So great to see you, Robin. Both your questions. So in our consultations, even in countries like Vietnam, there is a recognition that data localization, true data localization, is not going to be feasible nor practical in a global economy. And Juwita, as you probably well know, there is a 5-year grace period for Vietnam to adjust its local conditions as a condition of its joining the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so within Vietnam, they're already discussing ways on how to liberalize, if you will, some of their data governance frameworks in order to meet their obligations under those international agreements like CPTPP. And so this recognition of playing across the spectrum, if you will, has already started to take seed. They don't have the answers just yet, but they're having that conversation nationally. And interestingly, even within Vietnam, there was talk about how perhaps within ASEAN, we can have this conversation at the regional level about how to reconcile some of the data localization priorities, even in countries like Indonesia, with some of the more regional approaches, international approaches that other countries in Southeast Asia have started taking.
I think just to add to Elena's great points, I think there is, we need to demystify, at least in Southeast Asia, this notion that data localization would keep the data more secure. And I think this notion that data localization is, we build the data centers. I was on looking at you. Build the data centers within our country is, as a symptomatic sort of demonstrates this how can we extract economic value from these data centers that are located in the country. And so I think this is where partner countries such as Australia come in terms of building capacity. Because at the end of the day, as we alluded in the policy playbook, one of the principles is care. And care refers to maintaining the highest standards that allows data to be protected from cyber attacks. And we've seen this in Southeast Asia, whether in countries such as Singapore that puts forward, promotes and advocates for data-free flow, we've seen increasing data breaches. We also seen countries such as Vietnam who are advancing for data localization, who suffered various massive data breaches. And so I think we have to go beyond the question of do we keep the data within our shores, and as Annabelle mentioned about data sovereignty, but the question of do we have the capacity to really safeguard data. And this is where our principles of care and reliability, if I put it that way as well, comes into play, because the policy playbook is not just 5 principles of our wish list, but they do provide practical interventions that each country can think about implementing sound and pragmatic solutions to these issues of data localization and also or data free flow. And I think just one final point, Annabelle has mentioned, and Elena already also mentioned this about in Southeast Asia, we're thinking about these issues. And Annabelle said that this is the first report that thinks about an outward perspective from Southeast Asia. But also the report is actually an invitation for a peer-to-peer learning among Southeast Asians, ourselves in the Southeast Asian family. With, of course, the inclusion of the Philippines and other countries not included in the report, for us to really, get into the table and have that conversation about this data localization, but beyond that aspect of localizing data, but greater issues of cybersecurity, resiliency, and also ethical AI. I'll stop there.
Could I add just one quick point, actually, if that's okay? I think the one thing I wanted to say, as you both were answering, was sovereignty doesn't equal location. Right, and I think as we are thinking about it as a technology company, we're recognizing and hearing from our customers that sovereignty is about control. And there are many ways in which you can control the way your data is moving. And a lot of that is actually technical and probably more useful these days because data does have to flow is the technical controls. So I think reframing that conversation, as I mentioned, there are maybe circumstances where location does matter. Maybe it's less to do with security, maybe it's more to do with, community practices. I mentioned Maori data sovereignty, and that's part of the question. They want to ensure that they can control that's tied back to the land because that's part of their belief system. So it's making sure that we think about what sovereignty means for each different community, society, and then also the country level. I think the second thing I wanted to say is there's actually a lot of work being done at the ASEAN level for interoperability. So despite the fact that countries may be at different stages of development when it comes to like the digital policies in each of these countries, or they have different starting point philosophies, there is actually a lot that's being done to say, at least within ASEAN, can we ensure that data continues to flow? And these things are critical for 2 reasons. Obviously, there's the economy side, and I think everybody's heard that a million times, but for inclusion in and across ASEAN, because there is a lot of movement of labor within ASEAN. There is a lot of movement of services within ASEAN as well. So how do we make sure that communities that are trying to engage with the rest of ASEAN can continue to do so in a meaningful way? And I think that is why interoperability is such an important conversation. ASEAN, the Digital Data Governance Framework, already covers like 4 pillars of that. There's the MCCs that have been launched. So I think there are many, many ways in which ASEAN is working together, and I'm actually very hopeful that we'll be able to find something. And then ASEAN can go and negotiate as a region with other regions, and I think that's the other objective as well.
Any other questions? This lady.
I'm Chiu Ping from UKM. Congratulations to the panelists for launching this report. So I just very quickly read through the whole report. It is really welcoming. So I have several questions about standardization. So Singapore is leading in this area. So not only their standardization, government readiness match those in Northeast Asia, such as China, South Korea, and Japan, that presents a very huge gap with the rest of ASEAN and also in terms of East Asia or Asia Pacific. So we also know that capacity building is urgently needed. So how can an AI standard for East Asia can help other countries like the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos to gradually build up their capability to set up their own standard and also AI governance. So in my understanding, Japan, China, South Korea already have their own AI norm and standardization and governance principles. So it is in that regard that Singapore have their own corresponding AI principles as well as accorded in their national AI strategy. So Singapore is also the only country out of Southeast Asia have a direct collaboration on AI and cybersecurity with NATO. So in this regard, I think, could Singapore be the leading country to coordinate among the ASEAN member states to set up a kind of, like what the panelist has already said, an indigenous localized AI standard and governance. And we also know that the transformation of the AI could bring to industry. So already, as the 5 countries shown in the report are kind of ready, if not halfway there, how about the rest of the Southeast Asian countries? So how can we help them to match up the existing expectation and standard? Thank you very much.
And maybe one more question from...
Hello. Thank you for all panelists. I'm Amani from Naim Research. So my question is, how does the ethical framework is addressing the unemployment of humankind resulted from the rise of AI and machine learning? Because as we can see now, automation and mechanization have already replaced low-skill jobs and highly repetitive jobs. And the rise of AI and machine learning will mean even more jobs will be replaced by AI than from humans. And history already showed that economic always win, like how Soviet Union command-based economy cannot beat the market-based economy. And then what would happen if the AI labor is cheaper than human? How is the ethical framework will address that? Thank you.
So.
Hi, Chuping. So thank you for your question. I think Annabelle might probably want to add a bit about Singapore. But Singapore is, of course, very much advanced in the region in terms of thinking about some of these AI principles. So you'll see in our report, there's a website actually that complements our print report. And there's an interactive component where you can view the different countries and their participation in international fora, such as the International Standards Organization, ISO, or even the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, which helps to set standards, technical standards around the globe. And you'll see that only Singapore is a participating member in the ISO Joint Committee that specializes on AI principles. Indonesia is an observing member, but no other Southeast Asian country is a member of that Joint Technical Committee. Similarly, at the ITU level, only one Singaporean, no other Southeast Asian, has sat at the highest levels of the ITU leadership structure. And so we have a lot to think about. What I've heard from our stakeholder consultations as part of this report writing is that technical standard setting is very, very niche, it's very specific, and there needs to be a lot of expertise that goes into contributing to some of these discussions. But at the same time, I think we in the region need to reflect on our own willingness and capabilities to participate in these discussions. Because very often what I've heard, and this is just anecdotally of course, but I've heard this I think far too often, is that we're not ready yet. We're not at that level of technical capability. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the knowledge. To me, I think we need to stop using that as an excuse, because we can still be observing at these discussions, we can still be learning And it doesn't always need to be at the technical standards discussions. We can contribute to policy discussions, we can contribute to legal discussions, and I think really those are some of the key areas that we can actually make a difference in policy and legal space in helping shape the governance frameworks of some of these technologies. On automation, I think if you look at some of the numbers that are out there, automation is already happening, labor displacement is happening, but there are mitigation strategies that are taking place in different countries based on their contextual needs. And so governments are very aware of that risk. But I think also a lot of the replacement or labor displacement that's happening is just at the manual level. We need to think about some of the higher levels of automation in order to mitigate some of the coming risks.
Just a very, very quick reflection on ethical framework, which I think relates to both questions from colleagues in the audience, but also what was discussed before. Different actors have different priorities, right? So that's a challenge in terms of having a regional approach or having a common understanding, which is that there's different silos of national priorities, also regulation and private sector. So there's different sometimes conflicting challenges. So that's where a common ethical framework can help in terms of finding that universal understanding of what is ethical and what is right and what is human-centric. So I think that's where the again, to reiterate what I said before, the appeal of looking at this issue from an ethical framework. In terms of the question on unemployment, this is really, really important to UNESCO in our implementation of the recommendation. We have values and principles in there that AI technology should not be harmful to human beings. And if we're looking at the future of work, there was that McKinsey report, which was I think several years ago, and that's really going to affect this region, right? In terms of the changing nature of work, what sort of work is available, and in terms of is the education system today preparing young people for the labor market of tomorrow. So in terms of being guided by these understandings, what UNESCO is trying to do is offer capacity building initiatives and tools to our stakeholders in our member states in terms of preparing young people in skills training. This is beyond the work that we do with the education ministries as well, because the E in UNESCO stands for education, but also in terms of directly working with young people to raise awareness of these issues, to raise their understanding of these challenges and what it exactly means, and again, building their capacity to develop knowledge products and interact with this topic. So it's at the level of, yes, we're working with ministries of education in terms of curriculum development and all of those things, but also in the short term, we're directly engaging with young people. So all that to say, it really goes back to what Elena was saying in that this isn't just a conversation for technical experts on AI, but for everybody else, because we are all going to be impacted. We are being impacted by this, whether we understand the technical issues or not.
So, yeah.
I think just to address the first question about how about the rest of the other countries in Southeast Asia are thinking about AI standards, I could speak about my country, the Philippines. The Philippines has its early head start with thinking about its AI roadmap. I think the Department of Trade and Industry has released a roadmap a few years ago, 2021, under the Duterte administration. And a lot of the sort of AI initiatives in the region is actually being brought by public-private partnerships. And I could speak also about one of our case studies, which is Thailand, working with Microsoft and Mahidol University in coming up with the ethical AI framework. I think Microsoft is also working with Malaysia in terms of various initiatives on these fronts. So we see a lot of public-private partnerships. But I think with the rest of the ASEAN countries, such as Laos, Cambodia, Brunei, Myanmar, I think they are still very much thinking about this sort of their approach to AI. And I think this is where this notion or concept of peer-to-peer learning can come into play. Again, we go back to that conversation about the spectrum of how each countries in Southeast Asia can learn from each other, and also at the second level, at the second tier, how can they learn from, as Elena mentioned, from the global South in South Asia, and also in Latin America. I think the question about how we can address job disruption, particularly how our policy playbook recognizes or addresses that issue. I think if you look at the principle of inclusion, we actually highlighted one of the practices, which is launching an all-female hackathons. And across our 5-country case studies, we emphasize gender parity, that there is this untapped potential of increasing women's participation in tech-related jobs, not just in the boardroom, but also in a more sort of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field. And I'm very, very pleased that today I am joined by 4 strong, eloquent, and intelligent women who are forging a path for future women and girls when thinking about technology. And I think Southeast Asia needs to go and adapt or tap these reservoir of talents given the rising demand of digitalization across the region. I hope we answered your questions. Thank you. I'll stop there.
So perhaps Annabelle.
Very quick. I know we're running out of time, but I think just really 2 quick comments. One, so Singapore was one of the earlier countries in the world to address AI, responsible AI, and ethical AI. Being a first mover, an early mover, has its advantages, but also its disadvantages, right? So I think the conversation has evolved significantly from the time when Singapore first kind of launched their own thinking, their own report. And obviously they've been updating it as well, but I feel that the conversation on inclusion, for example, wasn't that present in that first early iterations globally, right? So I think it's, that evolution is something that ASEAN or countries in ASEAN can actually think about as they move forward. The other thing I wanted to say was that ASEAN ministers actually committed last year, at the end of last year, to starting an AI work stream. So that is ongoing in ASEAN. And I hope that this report, as well as others that are going to be more in-region focused, will be reflected as part of the work that the ASEAN ministers are doing. Final point perhaps on employment. I think that obviously with any technological disruption, whether that's AI, whether that's the use of computers, there will always be some kind of job displacement, right? Or maybe we look at it from a slightly different way, the need to restructure certain elements of employment in the economy. And so one thing that we've been doing, and very much from a technology standpoint, is actually doing a digital skills study. We do this every year, and we try to go beyond what we see in other skills studies, which is basically focusing on like K-12 education and university and what we can do there, but really going to employers and basically understanding from employers across different sectors, so not just the traditional technology sectors, but looking at accounting firms, looking at law firms, looking at media, companies, PR companies, and asking them what are the skill set gaps that you're seeing as you're trying to hire today for talent that are focused specifically on digital skills. Like what would you like to have a good to have, but you very rarely get, and then looking forward 5 years, what do you think are going to be the most important skill sets, and trying to map that back so that we're trying to shift the point of view that yes, obviously you need like maybe some AI scientists and you need some developers, but actually having any digital skill top up almost. So if you're a like designer and you can use key software that enables you to push that design further, that's a value proposition and a value add. So how do we think about jobs differently and identify the gaps today? And there's a huge demand, and basically enable. The report's APJ-wide. It covers, I think, 2 to 3 ASEAN countries today. We are expanding every year. We're adding more countries. So we're hoping to cover ASEAN 5 next year. So going into that level of detail to understand how to help with restructuring.
Just very, very quick, as Annabelle mentioned with job disruption, one of the key insights that we drawn from Indonesia is yes, there is job disruption at I think 30%, but also there will be new job opportunities, job titles, and as Annabelle has mentioned, that hasn't been existed or conceived of yet. And so we see this notion of embedding AI-enabled technologies to relieve human labor, but also it presents new opportunities for new jobs that have yet to be created in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so we are out of time, so I just hand it back to the MC.